Welcome to another Digiai.ACADEMY episode. Today I'm sitting with Julien Wera, who has been in major leadership roles in the industry for a very long time. You started off on the marketing side of things, and then as you progressed, you've gone deeper and deeper into development, and eventually starting your own studio. So welcome.
Thank you.
Let's get into it.
Yes.
All right. You've had such a fascinating journey. How did you get into the industry?
How did I get in? Well, I think like many people who get into the industry, I've always been, since I was kind of born with a controller in my hands, and I was always passionate about video games. Born with a Sega Master System controller, and then basically like learning about the games industry and all of that. And I think I was lucky enough to meet through the board gaming, role-playing kind of community in France, where I come from, that to meet people who were a little bit older than me, but that actually worked in the early games industry in France. And so that kind of, I was lucky that it gave me the opportunity to understand, like, okay, real humans that are just like you and me are actually making games. That's kind of cool. And so very early on, I was sure I wanted to work in games, and I had no idea what I could do. So I was part of the modding community. I did some fan projects. I was a terrible 2D artist on a fan sequel to Final Fantasy VI. I did some scripting and some kind of like fan-made MMOs and all of that. I went on. Basically, my idea was to work in the games industry, and as you were told back then, the people who work in the games industry, they're programmers, right? So, so after high school, I went on to an IT course to learn programming, and I was absolutely terrible at it, and I hated it. So there was a bad combo. But one thing that I discovered, when you're at university, you do all these programs, etc. One thing that I discovered is that I was actually pretty good at talking and organizing projects and all that kind of stuff. So I dropped off my computer science program and went into what in France is called information and communication. And then eventually I moved to Canada, which was essentially PR. So I went into learning public relations, but my will to work in the games industry had not stopped. So when I graduated, graduated from college in public relations, I decided that I would just apply to all the jobs anywhere in the world, and I was gonna get in games. And that's just how it is. So I applied to hundreds of jobs anywhere from my hometown of Paris to, I remember, Singapore, to LA, to Quebec City and Montreal, where I was living at the time, to Dublin. And I got a job at what was called a game master, which is basically mostly doing customer support, QA, and a little bit of community management at a fledgling MMO publisher, a Japanese group called Gala that was opening their European division in Dublin to publish free-to-play MMOs. And I was like, my goal was to get into the games industry. I would get in the games industry by any door. And I was like, I can do customer support. I can do community management. So I moved from Canada with like 2 suitcases, arrived in Dublin in this startup. I think it was employee number 5. And it was a great experience because as many startups, basically, there's so much opportunity for growth. And again, as many startups as my studio right now, everybody's wearing 20 hats, right? So this was absolutely amazing for learning. And as I was doing customer support, I did localization, I did a bunch of other things. And I went to my boss and I was like, well, I graduated in PR. There's nobody doing the PR for the company right now. Can I do the PR for the company? And you have to imagine that this is still, it's an international group. And there's this 21-year-old guy who barely started and who's coming in and say, can I be the PR representative for the group in Europe? And my boss is like, well, this is customer support job primarily. So you do your number of tickets, you do your quota of tickets per day. And then, after hours, once you finish your quota of tickets, you can do the PR. So I think like within a month of starting at that company, I was on stage at the Festival du Jeu Vidéo, which is now the Paris Games Week, announcing our first game. Because, why not? Just like nobody was doing it. I reached out to the organizers of the stage. I was like, hey, here's who we are. We're launching a game. We're launching 2 games, actually. Can I go on stage and just do the announcement and kind of release a press release, etc.? And then, things snowball from there, from community management and customer support into PR, from PR into marketing, and then eventually, over the course of something like 20 years, from marketing into product strategy, portfolio strategy, and then development as we are now.
I'm curious about your way in that way as well. I mean, do you remember that how you iterated on your way of well, more or less selling yourself, your CV or your interviews, etc.? What do you believe was the game changer for you? Were you lucky? I mean, luck plays a role usually on many things, right? But do you remember kind of how you were able to get the job or the jobs that you've had, especially early on?
I will say luck is definitely a huge part. I will also say that the games industry is the smallest. It's the smallest world within a world. Everybody knows each other, and so I actually think network is probably the biggest part. So I will never know whether that's the case, but for my very first job, which is no experience, straight out of university, I applied. And I had asked my good friend Thomas Bidot, who's the CEO at ICO Partners and had been one of my mentors throughout my career. He had some connection with the recruiting manager there, and of course we hadn't worked together. So I had asked for the permission to add him as like a personal reference, like a, how do you say in English, like a reference for, he could vouch that I'm not a terrible human, even though we hadn't worked together, so he couldn't vouch for my work skills. And so I think, when they received maybe 200 applications of young people like me with no qualifications, the fact that there was someone who knew, the fact that I knew someone that my boss eventually knew, was kind of like, okay, that got me a little bit outside. And I had done a bunch of, I think my CV was basically all the modding community stuff and all the volunteer kind of things in the games industry that I had done. And then afterwards, I want to say network is very important, because a CV is a CV, but when people know you, they know how you work, they know who you are as a person, and kind of like personal chemistry, human chemistry is extremely important in our industry. That's really, really important. I seem to remember that back at Paradox, the head of talent acquisition would tell me that 3/4 of all hires across the Paradox group were actually done through a network, as in through someone who's already employed at Paradox recommending someone they know for a role. That's huge for company that's like, at the time was maybe like 500-600 people, right? So I think knowing people and people being able to vouch for you as an individual, as a person, is extremely valuable. And because I was lucky enough to be so passionate about games that I was, joining events, talking to people, helping out a lot of people outside of my job, and helping out other studios, and very freely sharing knowledge and experience, and wanting everybody to succeed. Then eventually, the karma goes back to you, and positives or negatives, and people were happy to work with me more directly afterwards.
Being on the front side of things with support and all that stuff, were you able to be accepted more easily into the studio environment and with the devs? Because I tend to feel that being a QA or player support or that kind of thing, really gets you to understand what is going on with the players, but also being able to find priorities in what to fix or what to develop further, etc. How was your journey in that, and was there an acceptance early on, or did you have to fight for your way into the environment of lots of developers?
I think you always have to fight for your way. I think starting my career as a very, very player centric role, being like my first experience in the games industry, is literally talking to players who have problems and solving their problems over email, right? And I did that for a couple of years, and I think that's just an enormous experience that that I wish everybody had. Whether working, starting customer support is a great starting point for kind of business oriented people, and starting in QA is a great experience for development oriented people, I think. And then afterwards, it's a question of interpersonal skills, and it's a question of learning. One great chance that I had, which helped me a lot afterwards, is when I eventually moved to Sweden to join Massive down in Malmö, working on what would then become the division. I was joining Ubisoft, but I was not joining Ubisoft marketing. I was joining Massive as a studio, but to work on marketing and branding and kind of IP and all of that. And because Massive is a pure development studio and was much, much smaller than what it is today, they didn't know where to put a marketing person, right? So my direct report, my boss originally was the managing director of the studio, who had been the marketing director before. So he knew marketing, but he actually, for the day-to-day, he actually placed me in the game design team. So I was sitting with the game design team. I was doing my morning stand-up, and I was, for all intents and purposes, parts of the game design team of the division. And first of all, this was an amazing experience because those people from that design team who went on to do Division 2 and Star Wars Outlaws and all of that have, very quickly became, lifelong friends, and we still meet to this day, almost 15 years later, and, we're still very close friends. And also that got me to understand the game that we were making on a very, very granular level from the start. And that got me much more easily accepted. And that means that kind of the marketing part and the business part of that project was much more easily accepted into the overall process by the simple fact that I was there every day joining the morning stand-ups with them. Like I was not some business dude coming from a different country or a different continent telling them how they should do their game so that it sells better. I was with them every single step of the way, every day. And I think that helped me. I think that did help me a lot. And eventually, I ended up reporting to the senior producer for the project, who then helped, when she moved to DICE, she, more or less took me under her arm and kind of carried me with her into Stockholm and into my the kind of the projects that I worked on for a year and all of that. But, it's just remembering this kind of like happenstance that because they didn't know where to place me, they just placed me physically with the game design team. And it just that simple fact that was very much by accident, probably, that was really a boon and a blessing for me.
When you arrived at Paradox as Chief Product Officer, what was your mission? What did you bring with you from these other great studios that you worked in?
I arrived at Paradox at an interesting time of transition. This was a moment where the founder and former CEO had left his seat to a new CEO. It was very much a new leadership team, and specifically, there were a couple of projects that had been that were in the pipeline at Paradox that Paradox did not traditionally have the skill set to do. Some of them did not pan out and did not release, and some of them, released just recently, Bloodlines 2, and that project was, had been kind of like in ideation for a long time, and so there was two things that Matthias Lilia, who's now the deputy CEO for the company, told me. Is that one is that there were a few projects where they did not, they had the grand strategy expertise very, very well set, but kind of like larger scale RPGs or action games or anything like that, they were not so used to. So they wanted my expertise coming from DICE or Ubisoft, etc. And the second thing was that I came in, originally I came in as VP of product management, and a lot of the product managers had been coming from the production side of the industry, which means they were very focused on development, whereas the product manager role is meant to be really one foot into production and one foot into business and marketing, and kind of really making the bridge between those two worlds. And so they actually, when I was interviewing and discussing with them, they actually specifically wanted someone that was much more business oriented, because they thought that the product management team was too production focused. And so I was meant to counterbalance that. So it was a very interesting time. It was a big transition during that time at Paradox. There was a lot of cultural changes. To a large degree, Paradox was a very big it's still a very big company, but it has its roots into much smaller, tighter cultures. And so this, all of a sudden, I think we had, when I was there, 12 studios in something like 5 different countries. So you end up having many discussions around, all of a sudden, when for the past 20 years, a company has only worked in Sweden or with its own internal studios or something like that. And all of a sudden you have to, you work with the great folks at Harbor and Schemes in Seattle that have a different work culture, development culture. How do we work well with them? How do we make the most of their games, which are also quite different from like a European Universalis or anything? So it was an extremely interesting and fulfilling time, because there was so much to learn, and it's such a great company to learn. Actually, I to this day, myself and my co-founders and quite a lot of people I'm talking to around Moonrover, the studio that we founded a few years back, I said that I would not have been able to take on the role that I'm doing now, and basically lead the studio and found this company if I hadn't spent that time at Paradox, because this is where I learned so much, and I would say even on a business management perspective, a lot more than during my time at EA or Ubisoft, which are much larger companies, and therefore there's always someone else doing, finance for you or something. You can always rely on having the best experts in the world. When you're at EA, there's people who are best at their job for all the jobs, but that means that you never have to learn this. You just be like, somebody solve me this legal problem, and then these amazing lawyers show up and they're like, hi, we're solving this problem for you, which is absolutely amazing. But having to learn to do this yourself is also extremely fulfilling and important, particularly when like me, you go and start your own business afterwards. So I'll be forever grateful with from everything I learned during my time at Paradox.
Well, let's dive in a little bit to your experience of how great games are made. If we stay with Paradox for a while, you talked about defining what makes a Paradox game. How can a new studio identify and protect its creative pillars?
That's a really good question. I don't have a definite answer on this, but I can talk about how we defined our creative and our company pillars at Moonrover. I think in general, pillars and direction are not things that come from a PowerPoint where you present them to the companies like, this is the direction. For us at Moonrover, the pillars sort of define themselves over the first few months. I would say maybe the first like 6 to 8 months of us working together as a team. And as the founding team, and then the first wave of people who joined us, we had worked together before in other constellation at other companies. We knew each other for the most part, but then it's a new identity that you are building together. Some of us had worked together at Ubisoft or at EA or at Paradox, etc. So we came together, and then here and there the pillars that we kind of enshrined on our website or talked about, like creative generosity or the human-sized team. These are not things that we just like brainstorm over a meeting. These are things that just popped up in a conversation around us starting to build our own game, etc. And we were like, oh yeah, that's actually a great way to express what we're about. And so then we kept it, and then we talked about it and redefined it. So I think I would say like things come naturally. You have directions, like when you start something, when you start on a journey, you have to know where you want to go. But things change. I mean, that's game development basically. So it's important to be flexible, but we knew we wanted to, like, the fact of making cooperative games is something that we had from the very beginning. That was a very important direction for us. And even though we might end up making PvP games again or anything, like when we started our first game, we're like, okay, we all worked quite a lot on large-scale PvP games before, whether it's Battlefield, or I worked on Tribes and things like that. And we also had all worked on single-player games, and we wanted to apply all those learnings to co-op. But that's like a product direction rather than something creative. I think the core pillars came in as we worked together, and specifically one of our core kind of direction, I want to say like one of our core part of our identity as a studio is something that our creative director coined at some point, talking about creative generosity, which really means that we're open and transparent, and we accept ideas and suggestions from anywhere, right? And so that means that anyone, no matter their role, can provide feedback freely and can make suggestions on how to make a better game, or how to change the direction or adapt, etc. And because that's one of our core pillars, that means that the more we grew the team, even though we're still not an enormous team, the more we grew the team, the more influences there were. And so with every kind of like new people coming in, there was the game was kind of morphing into something which I think is bigger, better, and more diverse, because then everybody's kind of like bringing in part of their DNA into the project, even though we still continue very much in the same broad direction. It's like it's like you're planning a journey, and you're like, I'm in Stockholm, I want to go to Rome. You don't know necessarily. You can do two things. You can say, I'm going to go to Rome, I'm going to take these planes or these trains, and then we're going to be exactly there, and this is where we're going to stop, etc. Or you can just say, I'm in Stockholm, I want to go to Rome, and let's just figure out how we get to Rome. We're going generally in this direction, it's sort of south, and then let's enjoy the journey together and figure out together how we get to Rome, and make sure that the way we make it brings us joy and fulfillment, because that's also what's going to make a better product. Like I strongly believe that when developers are having fun making their game, you end up seeing this in the quality of the product afterwards.
Why is the size and structure of a team so critical to the creativity and productivity?
The size has been really important for us, I think, for two things. I think one is that when we started Moon Rover, the four founders, we had all worked for quite a long time, multiple decades for most of us, in the AAA side of the industry, and we'd worked on very, very large teams, 300, 500, 600 people more. And we're kind of fed up with this. In fairness, we also believed it was not required. So we always had. We always knew that Rover was not an art house. Like we wanted to make big games, impactful games that would reach millions of people, and that's still the case. But we really felt, looking back at our careers and the various projects we'd been on, that to make big, impactful games, you do not require 500 people. You do not require 100 people. Like that's an interesting thing with the development of the industry these days, where like AAA becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, because even just 10, 12 years ago, the biggest AAA games did not have 500 people. You could make enormous, what was like the biggest blockbuster of the year could be done with 50 people or 40 or anything like that, right? So we're like, what happened to the industry that now, on some, I remember sitting in discussion with the leadership of some of the big AAA publishers, and they were like, well, you can't make a game with less than 500 people or less than $100 million. And I was like, that's just crazy talk. Of course you can. And so we wanted to really go back into something smaller and nimbler. And we wanted to keep a very large part of humanity, in the sense of, I'm a very big proponent of just talking to people transparently, exchanging ideas, discussing. I'm a very big proponent of face-to-face discussion, exchange. And so when you're 600 people, this is just not possible. You end up doing so many presentations to teams that are like, over Zoom or Teams or whatever nowadays. But even before, when I worked at EA pre-COVID, it's very, very common working on Battlefield that I was standing in front of 150 people talking about the roadmap for the next year or anything like that. And then that's not an interpersonal relationship. It's much harder. You're talking to the many instead of talking to the few. It's not even a discussion, right? It's I am talking at you, hoping that you will understand what I mean, even though we have a different point of view on the world. We have different cultural background. We have different things, right? So we wanted to go to a place where we could know everyone in the studio. We could know them personally, right? We want to always stay at a size where, for me as a CEO or any of us as leads or anything, I want to know what's happening. I want to know, are people happy? Do they have kids? What do they like to do outside of gaming, etc. I want to be able to sit down and have a conversation, share a lunch with anyone, and know them on a personal level, like as humans and not just as colleagues. And so to do that, you need to remain a relatively small size. I think there's a huge benefit in having that size because you're also extremely nimble. You can adapt, you can change, things go really fast, and you can feel. It can sound a bit wishy-washy, but when we playtest in the office, I remember when we were at our previous office, which was a lot tighter, let's just say it like that, as first company office, not the fanciest. We were all like really close together, and when we were playtesting, when the electricity was not shutting down because our computers were drawing too much power from the building, we were playtesting, and I remember Jamie, our creative director, just looking at me and being like, "Shh, can you hear it? Can you hear it?" And then it's the buzz of the studio, people having fun, playtesting, people, outbursts of like, "What, did you see that?" and all of that. And we were, essentially, we had 2 rooms, but we were essentially all in the same room, and you could feel that excitement. And that was just so powerful. And it's such a great indicator that you have something that's really, really working. Which, I think I know companies that have done really well with larger, and, I know companies they're doing extremely well with full remote teams, etc. But I think this whole like, just listening to the buzz of the studio, or listening to people having fun, or just walking to someone's desk and being like, wouldn't it be cool if we added this weapon and you animate it like this? And then you're just like our animator showing how the character should animate, rather than booking a meeting and doing a drawing on PowerPoint to show all of this changes. And for this, I think, it was key for us to remain, we call it human size. It's like, basically, it's not an exact number, but it's we're gonna grow as big. The idea is to stop growing the moment where we feel that we cannot know every person in the studio on a human and personal level. And
what is that size right now, by the way?
We're about 20 people right now. What is the maximum is a very good question. I think we can go somewhere around 40 or something, and probably that would be a moment where we're working on 2 projects side by side. I think when I was at Paradox, a lot of the teams were about 20 people, and Paradox is not an indie publisher. It's very firmly in the kind of like AA plus. And they did magic with 20 people working. So I think it's a good size. And you go up and down, and you have external partners, and you have contractors and freelancers coming in for a time, and all that kind of stuff. So I think, it's hard to know. Under, somewhere between 50 and 70 is probably like the highest we would ever want to go, and probably split into multiple teams, so that there is, each team can have this kind of interpersonal knowledge and connection and all that kind of stuff. But for now, we're quite happy staying somewhere between 20 and 30 on a single project.
Yeah, is that kind of where you feel that agility is at its maximum as well?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we can all know what everyone is doing. I think there's really this thing of like both being able to feedback and discuss things very easily, but also being able to get excited and inspired by what everybody does. We have a tradition, which I guess is very common in many studios. On every Friday afternoon, we do show and tell time, which is where we actually we're still small enough that we don't present this on a screen. Everybody, we stand up, and then we go behind everybody's computer, and people show on their machine what they have worked on during the week, what they've achieved, if they've made something that's visual, or they explain it, something they show documentation or anything like that. And that's a great moment every week, because you can feel the excitement in the room. You can be inspired by what your colleagues have made. And so that also enables a lot of like organic ideation, creativity, passion, which I think is very important.
In my experience, and Paradox, I think, has also spoken about this, the overconfidence and the need for more disciplined prototyping. What lessons have you taken from that? What learnings have you been taking with you until this point? And how does Rover really approach prototyping as well?
I think the biggest lesson I have is that I love constraints, right? The discipline is very easy at Rover, because our budget is very limited, and time and money go the same. It's the same axis. The longer you work, the more money you burn. And so, particularly nowadays, where the industry is in a very difficult place, where funding is scarce or non-existent, we have developed this discipline of development very, very quickly. Also because we actually bootstrapped the studio with no external funding for quite a long time. And even though this was not fun, to basically work for a long time without money, and you end up, knowing your colleagues on a very personal level, you end up having discussions around putting food on the table and things like that. That taught us discipline in terms of how efficient we can be and how fast we need to go, etc. I think the biggest mistakes I've seen in the past, particularly on the AAA side, has been where money or time wasn't an issue, right? And I think there's great. I've been in project where there's great intention to give creatives the time and the space to experiment. But I think some companies, and possibly Ubisoft being one of them, who's very outwardly, at least, like very creative first and very creative oriented, sometimes forgot that giving constraints to creatives is what makes good games. Giving, unlimited time or unlimited budget on projects has never made better games. I think there's a need to find a balance between having not enough, not enough time or not enough money, and having too much. And I think, one of the reasons probably that we founded Moonrover is that we had an overreaction over the waste that is quite often done on the AAA side of things, where there's just a lot of time and a lot of money that is wasted and producing nothing that players are going to enjoy, or nothing at all. And so I think constraints are very important, and they need to be very clear. That's also another thing that ties into the human size and all of that, which is also a very important pillar of our studio, is transparency, right? One thing that I loved when we started Moonrover is, having worked previously at many publicly traded companies, there has to be a lot of secrecy because there's laws around insider trading, etc. I love at Moonrover being able to transparently talk to anyone about what's our financial situation, what's our roadmap, etc. Giving this context to people, not only does it build trust, it builds confidence, and also they know I'm not trying to make them guess where we're going by using, roundabouts or anything, because they're secrets. They know exactly where we're going and why, because they have full context. Which, in big companies you cannot necessarily do for legal reasons, right? It's not necessarily a choice. So I think communicating the constraints so that people on your team do not think that those constraints are arbitrary. It's like, why do we need to ship at that date? Because someone has decided, or we need to make the quarterly target or anything. When you're an indie studio, a lot of the time it's like, why do we need to ship at that date? Because our money goes to this month, and so we need to ship this month so that we get money back by selling the game and all of that, right? So then people are like, okay, I understand. This is very clear and also very practical. So we're gonna do our best to ship the best game possible by that date for that reason and all of that. Like, it's so much easier to be able to communicate freely and transparently with people.
So with that, with your background as well, knowing, I know that you're very much into research as well, and loving being informed, whether it be data or any kind of experience that you can get from that. How do you balance innovation and risk when exploring, like with your new project right now, which is a co-op game, for example? And do you rely on feedback? Do you do a lot of research throughout the project as we go?
I think the balance is difficult to find, but in general, lack of innovation is a risk on its own. I get to be in a lot of very frustrating conversation with people, a lot of them on the financial side of the industry, who are telling me like, okay, so the problem now is that there's a lot of games and a lot of them look exactly the same, but there's a lot of noise and it's hard to break out, etc. And as a result, their stance is often like, we're going to take as little risk as possible. We're going to do something that's been tried and proven many times. And so they just end up complaining that there's too many games that look too similar, and just making one more game that's very similar, because they're afraid of innovation. Or innovation, it comes with risk. You can't necessarily back things up. I think the games that are winning the games that are standing out from the crowd are the games that have a strong creative vision, that take risk, calculated risk, right? Creative risks are good to take to a degree. If everybody on your team can be behind taking a creative risk, I'd rather take creative risk than take production risks, for example. We tend to be we tend to have these big discussions around like, okay, this is a creative direction and we stand by it. We think it's very strong. We back it up with data as much as we can. We do as much user play testing as we can, given that we have very little budget. And then we're like, okay, within these parameters, we go in that direction. Then there's big discussions around what is the scope? How much content do we put? How much content do player care about? And those are production risks. They're like, do we have enough time? Do we have enough budget to create X amount of levels or X amount of play time or this new system? So I think it's balancing, like the risk can come from many areas. You can risk being, but choosing where you take your risk. Like I would never want to risk making a bland game. I think the games that win are the games that stand out, and to stand out, you need to take creative risk, and then you calculate your production risks where they are. I think a good example in my past life of this has been Battlefield 1, which is, one of the highlights of my career in so many ways, but that was fuck, can we swear here?
Yeah.
It was an awesome game. It was an awesome game to work on, but it was also it was an awesome game on its own, and the team itself was really fantastic. And actually, all of the co-founder of Rover worked together on that game, amongst many of other of our friends who are now at various companies around the world. And the choice of World War I was a creative risk, and we had to sell it so much internally within EA that when we actually announced the game, finding that the players were so much more receptive to this and accepting of this than the leadership at EA had been. It felt like the actual marketing campaign with the players was just so easy compared to actually selling internally the idea of making a World War I Battlefield game to EA across the board. But we really felt, and I remember doing these endless presentations around we cannot do another modern military. Like Battlefield 3 and 4 had been amazing and they were still amazing, and doing another one at that time was just not the right choice. We needed diversity, we needed a change, we needed to stand out rather than get closer and closer to Call of Duty. We needed to assert the Battlefield identity and all of that. But that was a creative risk. And then on the flip side, there were some choices that we made on that project, for example, to not actually integrate the latest and greatest technological advancement of the Frostbite engine. And we made those choices because we did not want to risk the stability of the game. DICE had a very well-earned reputation for shipping great broken games that, eventually got fixed over time. Battlefield 3, I remember I was at Massive when it shipped and I could not play it on most machines. Battlefield 4 was extremely broken when it shipped. They were amazing games, and we made a choice as a team, as a development team, to not go there. Which was also, not necessarily very well accepted by some of our leadership, because they were like, no, but this new feature is going to make it look so much better or play so much better. It's like, yes, but then we risk having another buggy launch, and we didn't want. So choosing where you put your risks, it's like having a pile of risk coins, and you're like, you have creative, you have technology, you have production, timeline, and all of that. Choosing where you put your risk is, I think, a really important thing to do. And I think on Battlefield 1 it paid out, and on some other project it doesn't, right? It's you never know. Games are at the crossroads of technology and creativity, and so they're very hard to evaluate. But my sword is on the creative risk is what delivers the most value to players, rather than technology risk or scope creep and all of that.
Yeah, I think Battlefield 1 is such a interesting example and a fun thing from your career for sure. I mean, for me, it's still peak with DICE. I mean, I'm playing Battlefield 6 a lot, and I'm loving it. But even when I go back to Battlefield 1, and even now, I've seen a lot of people as well going back and highlighting it again. It feels like it could have been released now, and it still holds up so well. The onboarding is incredible. I mean, the whole single player experience is really there's no fault in it. Not only do you get onboarded in understanding the various mechanics, the various things that you need to do in being a medic or all those kind of functions, but also historically and the music. I mean, oh my God, the intro for even the company brands and stuff when everything starts off, it's like it just puts you in full on cinematic mode. It just draws you in. I think it's a great game to get people to understand how you properly onboard people, and so with that, I mean, what do you think about live service and business models? And I mean, if we just talked about creative decisions versus production decisions, etc. What are your thoughts on different kinds of business models? You've experienced quite a few of them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I started my career working on free-to-play PC MMOs, and it was an interesting time because it was the early 2000s, and so most of my job as a PR working on those was to explain what free-to-play was. Nobody actually believed that the game was actually free, and explaining how it works and how it's a valid business, etc. And then I worked on premium. I worked on some casual games when I was at PopCap that were more like free trial and then buy the full thing, etc. I think all business models are valid. I think it really depends on what you want to do. I was lucky at the beginning of my career. I was working with Korean game developers for whom the free-to-play business model had been, basically the default in Korea for the past 10 years. And it was brand new in Europe, but it had been established. So they knew exactly how to design and why. And I was also lucky that the company we were working for had a model that had targets of profitability that were not crazy. Like, it was not a greedy company. It was a very respectful company that had been established in Japan because the founder believed back in the 90s already that video games were a way for people to connect with each other and form friendships. And it had these values of connection and communication and people discovering each other, beyond boundaries of, borders and all of that, which also meant that I don't feel, maybe it was not my job at the time, but I don't really have a memory of us being pressured into hiking the price or doing more, sales on a specific month or anything like that, even though we were profitable. And I still realize that the very first game I worked on, which is a free-to-play MMO called Fly for Fun, or Flyf, is still, I think it released in 2003 in South Korea, 2007 in Europe. It is still running, still profitable. Now they ported it to HTML5 so it can be played on phones, and it's still working, and there's still people loving it, and there's still an active community, etc. And it's been free to play all along, right? So you got this, and I remember, as PR back then working on free to play, being attacked and people, it's abusive and it's all of that. And I was like, having the numbers, I was like, well, 85% of our player pay nothing. And literally the 15% who do pay, and some of them paid a lot and some of them paid very little, but the 15% conversion that we had, they were paying for everyone to enjoy. Like, they were basically supporting the cost of the server and the staffing and the further development, etc. So I didn't feel like there was any evil in there, but it's like any tool, it can be used or misused. so I think you need to the business model choice needs to come with both the what you want to achieve as a game studio, and then what is the skill set of your team, right? Because I worked with great free-to-play designers on great free-to-play games, and then I also worked with teams who were told you have to do free-to-play because this is basically for big corporations that are looking for this big ongoing revenue, etc. The appeal of free-to-play is that there's no ceiling to what people can spend, right? Because you design free-to-play around a lot of consumables, and basically players can spend without a limit. Whereas if you release a premium game, then you charge $20 or $30 or $40 or $60 or whatever, and then that's what players can spend unless you have DLC and that kind of stuff. But like this idea for companies which are meant to generate a profit, this idea of not having a ceiling to the expense is very, very attractive. So I think in the past, like maybe 15 years or 20, a lot of studios who knew how to make great premium game, great game experiences, have been more or less successfully forced into designing different gameplay loops, kind of forced into free-to-play where it wasn't necessarily their forte. And that can lead to many things. That can lead to a great game that is ruined by bad monetization. That can lead to a great game that doesn't make enough money, because that's the risk in free-to-play, right? You can have a great game with lots of players, which means you have a lot of server costs and customer support and all of that. And if your game is not designed well that players will want to spend, then you're actually having an amazingly successful game that loses money every month, which is very difficult. And so it's really about like, where is the skill set? What do you want to achieve as a company, as a studio? And do you understand what you're getting yourself into, right? It's the again, in the example of having a studio that knows only how to do premium games, so that is kind of like asked to switch or decides to switch to free-to-play. They don't necessarily have the experience of running customer support on a free-to-play game, or knowing how to deal with billing platforms, and the high complexity of these things. So I think everything is valid, everything is open. I think it's great that there's a lot of choice for developers and players out there. And then I think it's just a matter of having the right team for the right job, for the right audience as well. There's, even within premium games, you have things like, some game genre, thinking about Silksong recently, it's in that thing. Those games are usually priced, $20, $30, etc. It's not that they're not worth 70, they probably are, from a quality perspective, but like that audience is used to this price point. And when Silksong went in at the price points that they did, which stayed within kind of the lane of this genre, they also showed understanding and respect for the player base. Whereas if they could have gone out with a $60 game, they would probably have sold a lot, but they would probably have that would have been a misunderstanding of the fans of these Metroidvania games, right? So I think knowing what your audience is willing or not willing to do and to pay for, and all of that is important. So it's a very complex question, which I think has been answered in two simplistic ways by many companies for the sake of, you could say greed, or you could say just company strategy, not really understanding what their studios are capable of doing, or what it entails to do X, Y, or Z, right?
How do you implement research in that then? How do you solve the equation from your experience? Knowing also that, if you think about audience, if you think about business model, if you think about design of the game, how do you get those three to resolve in the best way?
I mean, if you have the time and the resources to actually do both consumer validation but also internal research in terms of, I think it's about marrying those three things as you highlight, right? I think on the one end, doing a lot of fundamental research on who your audience is. If you're working if you're working on a new IP, it's harder because it's new, so you don't have an existing audience. I was lucky to work on Battlefield, for example, and EA being an extremely data-driven company, just regularly we tested and did consumer validation on new games, but they just also did regular every other year or something, like, let's research who the Battlefield player is as a whole, because we know we're going to do more Battlefield games. And so that's incredibly valuable data. And what do they play and how do they pay and all that kind of stuff. That's one thing, extremely valuable. The second thing is, who are your developers? Do they understand the teams that are making your games? Has anyone in Studio X, Y, or Z ever designed a free-to-play game? Because I've seen so many studios, particularly on the very large scale kind of blockbuster side of the industry, being like, okay, this has to be free to play, so we'll take that studio that makes a great game and we'll just hire a monetization designer from this previous company. And it's like, well, that monetization designer can probably design a great loop, but then that, it's forgetting that your lead game designer, your creative director, your producer, your live operations and backend people also need to be aware of what it entails to have a free-to-play game. So that's often an oversight. And I mean, I would also say, particularly in the Western world and in development studios in Europe and North America, we have a tradition of premium. So finding the talent that has that experience is very, very difficult. And in fairness, I've never worked in Korea, but I could imagine that actually finding great, premium developers or people who've never worked on a free-to-play game in Korea is probably also very difficult, right? So it's a question of available talent. So you have digging into what your consumer wants and then digging into what your team can do, possibly like, is this the right team for the job? If your company strategy calls for an ongoing live service free to play in between your premium games, for example, do you have the right team? Do you need to buy a team? Do you need to work with an external studio that can do that? Matching that, and then it's figuring out, okay, if you decide to go a direction, what is the right creative direction for this? Right? It's the whole. I did not work on it, but I played it. I played a lot of Battlefield Heroes, which was kind of easy studios here in Stockholm, going into free to play and choices from going third person rather than first person, and the art direction, so that there can be a lot of crazy costumes on sale at the item shop and all that kind of stuff. Like, that game was built from the ground up to be free to play, and so it had a creative and design direction that was adapted to that. But that's not always the case. So it's very complex and it requires kind of a lot of data absorption ahead of starting to make a game. And then there's the taking a risk, right? Because, even at that scale, again, we're talking AAA here, but at that scale, even just taking the time to gather that data is probably more time and money invested than many indie game budgets and timelines combined, right? So just even doing that investigations is important, but it's also very expensive. So that's also a risk on its own.
Has there been do you have an example where this married nicely, where your experience on being at the front of everything with players, or that you bring research into current development, where things have changed trajectory, or a decision was taken that turned out to be the right decision?
That's a good question. I'd probably have very specific examples that I'm legally not allowed to actually talk about, but I want to say that, not related to business model, but probably, if we go back on Battlefield 1, I think, it was a time at DICE where the marketing function had changed, name many times, because it was not just marketing anymore, or it was a different definition. So you started as a marketing manager and then my title got renamed to Director of Product Strategy for a few months, and then it became brand because it needed to be more than just a product, like a whole brand, like the whole Battlefield and Mirror's Edge were the two franchises that I worked on. But really, the definition of my role was to be the advocate of the player and the market towards the dev team, which is why the actual like marketing team, EA marketing, was in a different office somewhere else. They were focused on bringing the game to market. But the reason why myself and my team were in the studio is because we needed to be embedded to the team to advocate for the player. And so I don't know if there were like very specific examples. It was actually more of an ongoing thing. It was more of a, doing a review of the product or the plan or the roadmap or anything, and saying like, always having the point of view of the players, always having the research, not always having the research, but a lot of the time having the research, a lot of the time being asked, what do you think? Do you think this will be well received? Do you think we can do that? And sometimes very early on planning for problems, right? And having contingencies. It's like, okay, we have to make certain decisions that are not player first, as we would say back then. They were like, we know we're making these decisions for production reason or business reason or company strategy reasons, and we know players are not going to like it. How do we make it up to them? How do we work through this, knowing that players are not going to be happy of that specific choice that we have to make either way? So being in that conversation on an ongoing basis, like always sitting with the development kind of leadership and decision makers, etc., it just made everything much more important and much smoother. It was also very important because we led the consumer testing. We, as in the brand team, we organized all the focus groups and all that kind of stuff. And when we showed the game early on to players, and we really insisted to bring on with us to meet with the players and have firsthand kind of like, visceral feedback, with the design leadership, the artists, etc., so they could understand. So it was very important that it was not just me organizing, getting consumer feedback, going in front of the team at a team meeting saying, this is what players say. We would bring people to witness behind the one-way mirror. This is what they think about World War I, or this is what they think about Call of Duty, and why they like this game rather than ours. And then, because it's so, again, we go back to the humanity. It's like, you look at someone, you get all the body language, you get all the like visceral reaction of like, okay, I understand this much more than if I had read a report afterwards. So the delivery of the information, being really physically there, was also very important.
Staying with that topic a little bit about, culture, leadership, united front, killing darlings together, being creative together. As a CEO, what has been your biggest leadership learning since founding Moon Rover?
There's been so many. There's
Top
been,
3?
There's been so many. It's been hard. It's hard to, because I did a lot of things in the games industry before founding Moon Rover, but starting my own company was never a thing that I knew how to do. So learning everything.
What immediately comes to mind with the question?
What immediately comes to mind? There's some example. One of the things is that I have actually learned to let go, which is not easy, because people who know me will say that I'm a little bit of a control freak, and I think when it's your baby, it's your company, and all of that, you can have that tendency to be even more. Also because you can see the direct consequences, etc. And also, you coming from larger or smaller companies, you learn you develop this instinctive thing of like, will if I don't have control over something that's happening, like, will I get blamed for this, or will my boss yell at me for not having been involved, for actually letting that team do their thing without even knowing, by like fully trusting them. And so fairly early on, that's a great example. When we had our first wave of people joining us after besides the founders, I wanted their onboarding to be perfect, because I was like, it's important. It's also very symbolic. It's our first employees are joining us. They're trusting us. They're going from more secure jobs into joining our startup. I felt this sense of responsibility, and for some reason, I don't even remember the reason, I wasn't there on their first day. And I remember having that discussion with Jamie. I was like, I think we should move their start date so I can be there and I can make sure everything is perfect. And he was just like, Julien, we're not at EA anymore. Everything doesn't have to be perfect, and also you don't have to be there for everything. And he called me out on my control freakness, and I was just like, you know what? This is also right. We define our own terms. Maybe a relaxed onboarding is exactly what we need, versus the everything has to be like pixel perfect, because we're a much more loose company and we trust people and all of that. So I think that's a learning that stayed with me, because few people have through my life there to call me out on my need for control, and I was just like, okay, I took that in, and I was like, oh, that was fairly important for me as a learning, and it's actually learning to be that perfection is not actually necessarily something to aspire to, is something quite important, which you move away when you spend a lot of time in AAA, like when you do Battlefield 6. And it's so much money and so many people, and the revenue targets are numbers that are so large your human mind can barely comprehend them, and you charge $70 for the game, for a game that's like from a franchise that is beloved around the world. There's so much pressure on making sure things are perfect, and then learning that when you're in a different company. I learned that at Paradox as well, that, it's not the same. The players don't have the same expectations. They want things to be good, but sometimes, it goes to the balancing of creative race versus technical. Sometimes it's like, it needs to be perfect, a grand strategy game. Of course, if everything is perfect and amazing, it's great, but like, what matters is that the design is good. What matters is that, these very specific features are great. And these other things, they're important, but they don't matter as much to the player. And so from a leadership perspective, going into Rover, learning to unlearn and to adapt to a new context, to build a new context from scratch, from nothing, has been a really great personal journey for me of like, right, this is not the previous companies. Like, what I have learned before does not necessarily apply here, and actually building our own culture is so much more important, and trusting and being open and transparent and being human and all of that. So I think adaptation, clearly.
On your webpage, you have words like creative generosity and human-sized ambition. What does that mean in practical terms for and with your team?
So, I mean, creative generosity, exactly, it means, we were talking about it earlier, it means openness. It came in, as I explained, the, all these pillars came in kind of like naturally through basically the first year of us having a company and building the game, etc. So I remember exactly when it came up, it was actually talking about our narrative director, Christopher Emgord, who kind of builds the world and the IP and the characters, and we were talking a lot about sharing, and someone else on the team was saying how generous Christopher is with just feedback and input, and how he leans into, someone has an idea of like, oh, this character thing, or like this, oh, I've read this other story that relates, and then they're bringing everything they have to the table, and how he freely and openly leans into, yes, this is great, those are great influences, etc. And so that's kind of like how it came up, talking about the creative generosity, and that we basically want to build a studio where everyone is just welcoming feedback and input and influences from anyone, no matter their role or their experience or anything, because everything is valid. And then you make a choice, right? You don't take everything in. It's not about having everyone's opinion, and putting this together and trying to make the best of it. It's like welcoming all input and then making a choice to go in one direction or another. And so that's where the creative generosity came from. And then there, in the human size, as we talked about as well, it's this idea of always be, because there's what are the definitions? Our industry has a problem with definitions, like what's indie, what's AA, what's triple I, whatever does that mean? Quadruple A, quintuple A. And then there's like, what's a small team? What's a large team? And like I think about us as a small team, but I meet so many people who are like, no, a small team is like 3 people. Small team is it's like so many solo devs, etc. So we ended up like bogged down in definition, but we wanted, and we were asked to quite a lot when we were pitching the studio, like, what's your ambition? How big do you want to go? And all of that. And we say, okay, we want to stay human size. That means a size where we can know everyone personally on a human level, not just on a work level, not just their position on an org chart or in a spreadsheet or knowing what they do professionally, but human size is, big enough that we can know everyone on a human level. And whatever is that number, I think we'll when we hit the boundaries, we'll know it. It's this, I mean, I guess you've been in being in small companies as well. This moment you walk into the office and there's someone and you don't actually know whether they work here or not.
Yeah.
It's a really creepy moment, because you're like, should I let, someone walks behind you at the door entering the office and you're like,
do I know you?
Exactly. Do they work there? It's how do I, and we never want to reach that moment. And that's basically the important thing. Like, we always want to know everyone. So that's been a good pillar and a good direction for us, because it also defines how do we design a game, because we want to make big, impactful games while staying human size. So we have to design with that constraint in mind. We have to design with that budget in mind. It drives our creative decisions. So I think it was very important to define at an early level. It's also important because when we hire people, they're saying, what kind of studio are you? What drives you? What are your values? It's important for them. Hiring someone is like a two-way contract. It's a two-way handshake. Like, they want to know where they're gonna, work and live and kind of like spend their creativity for the next few years, hopefully. And you want to know whether they're gonna be a good fit. And so you have to a degree, define who you are.
Burnout and crunching has been something that it's been part of our history quite a bit in our industry. So how do you build teams that stay healthy and creative and motivated? And any learnings from the past on what what are you applying at this point?
That's a really, really good question. That's a really good question. I think this is one of the area where I have to learn so much more. There's so many aspects of this. One aspect being, of course, we talk a lot about good planning, right? It's the whole, like, you will, in theory, you don't lead people to, work overtime or work too much to an unhealthy level if you've planned well. So there's just the right amount of tasks. You need just the right amount of work and challenge for people to be interested, motivated, excited, because you need to be challenged to be excited. If it's just too boring, too repetitive, you lose the creativity, you lose this kind of adrenaline, this kind of like drive to go to work every morning. but you need not, you know, it needs to stop there and not go too much where people are overwhelmed or anything like that. So that's one thing. One of the things that I've also learned is that burnout does not necessarily just come from overwork. I think we today, in the industry being what it is, there is a lot more mental health issues that are driven by the uncertainty, the fear, the instability. You know, we're a funded startup. There's a lot of uncertainty on where the next funding is going to come from. There's a lot of things like that, and it can really generate a lot of stress, too much stress, without necessarily meaning that there's too much work. And not having not enough work, which is not our case, but I've seen it in other studios. Like, I've seen people burn out from not having enough work, never being challenged, feeling that they're not useful. And so it is interesting, because I think the level of stress coming from kind of, chaos and uncertainty that we have in the industry, and that we have possibly at more certainly at Rover right now as a startup in this environment, it's not at all the same as what I've seen with people burning out on when I was at EA, or when I worked for Riot Games on League of Legends and stuff like that, where it was really people working too much and not realizing their own science and their own bodies. So I don't have a perfect formula. I think we need to do better as this. I think there's an importance for the industry to model the behavior, for the leadership in the industry to actually model the behavior, which is, it can be very hard. Like, I would never define myself as a workaholic, but I love my job and I work a lot. And I also see it as my responsibility as the CEO of a company to be always doing the maximum I can, because I have a responsibility towards my amazing colleagues, to make sure that they are well taken care of, and all of that. But that also, I need to always remember that it's also quite good when the leadership is like, I'm going on vacation, and so should you. You should take a break, or you should talk to people when you're not feeling well. All that kind of stuff. Like, being in leadership does not mean being an iron human that doesn't have feelings. It means actually modeling the behavior that you want people to have. Sorry, it's a very deconstructed answer, but I think it is something that hits home pretty hard in these difficult times. And one of the way we're trying to manage this at Rover is through constant communication, transparency, being present. For me as a CEO or a creative director or a technical director, like always being available for people who want to come and talk to us, always being able to answer any question they might have. And sometimes the answer might be, I don't know, and I genuinely don't know, and we will work on it together, or this is when we will know. Things like that, which I think helps, because, even though information might create stress, lack of information creates even more uncertainty, right? So we have that possibility to be transparent with people and not hide. This is also about treating people as adults, which I've been in many conversations in my past where in leadership, bad news came in or something like that. People were stressed about things, and they're like, okay, we can't tell that to the team. It's like, oh, the team can handle this. They're adults. And if you treat them like adults, and if you give your trust in them, then they will trust you back. So here, being a small team and all of that, we're trying to apply that across the board. Good communication skills, and then being, goes back to the human side, actually being attentive to signs. This person stayed at the office too long. This person does not, look too well. What is happening? Do they need help? Do they know that they can ask? Do they know what resources we have available to help? It's not perfect. It's very difficult because it's human relationships, and humans are the most beautiful and complex of beings. But it's important to actually make the effort, and being a smaller team helps in that.
What about when you're hiring them? What qualities and mindsets do you value most besides the obvious on technical skills?
I look for maturity. And maturity is not a question of age, it's a question of behavior. People who are mature in their approach to the world, not just work, but like, okay, their approach to interpersonal relationship and all of that is important, because maturity helps navigate these troubled times. It helps, when I communicate something transparently to people, if they have, I would like them to have the maturity to understand what it is, and not freak out or not misunderstand it, etc. So maturity is great, and I think, interestingly enough, maturity comes a lot from, at least to me, it comes a lot from experiences outside the games industry, because the games industry it's a lot of things, but it can be a bit comfortable. I know when I was at Paradox, we we're establishing a program for, like, high potential, high achiever, and there's a good amount of very young people who'd been at Paradox basically since their first job, who'd climbed the ranks, and they were amazingly talented. And here and there, one of my old colleagues from the leadership team, I remember walking to lunch and being like, God, I wish they could go and spend 6 months in like a meat packing plant, because they're so good. But if they don't need more technical skills or anything. They need real world experience. Like, they need to be challenged. They need to understand what the world is outside of Paradox, which is a great company that treats its people well. There's this thing of like, can we just send them over to, like, I don't know, work as a waiter for 6 months and understand direct contact with customers and all that kind of stuff. And so there was this thing of like personal human maturity, which I think for people who've been for little time or a lot of time in the games industry, if all you know is like working at DICE, you have a very skewed vision of the world and what it is to work. So you might have the technical skill set, but you might not be able to fit in from a human level at a different company. So I think there's that. I've been absolutely amazed by some of the interns that we've taken in at Rover, for so many reasons, both on a human level and on a skill set level. And one thing that surprised me is that we had a good amount of people who were retraining as game developers as their second career. So we've had people come in as interns coming out of the game assembly, the school here in Stockholm, who were in their 40s and had kids and had been an architect or a music producer or something. And so they brought in that real world experience to their work, which is this kind of like highlight, which they brought in as humans a lot to the team beyond the fact that they were relatively new to the job on a skill set perspective. So I'm generally looking for this kind of human, I was about to say talent, like this kind of human qualities, and to make sure that people would be a good fit for the kind of journey that we're on, and that this is what they want. Because it's not the same. Being at a startup is something that I would recommend to anyone who starts in the industry, because you get to wear all these hats, you get to learn so much. I was lucky to be hired as a startup in my first job, and I would not have done the things I did if I had been at a much bigger company where I would have been like a small cog in a big machine. But it's also not for everyone. And so it's very specific. When I interview people, I'm like, are you sure you want to do this with us very specifically, and why? and what are you bringing as a human, as a person? What are you bringing to the table? And is it going to be a good fit, or are you going to hate it? Like, I really don't want to. I want to never hire someone who's going to hate it.
You want to set the right
here.
expectations.
Exactly.
Across between you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think that will lead us into the coming questions as well. You know, you put on your mentor hat a bit. For people who are entering the industry today, and whether in design, marketing, or production, what 3 skills should they be developing right now?
Okay, I'm gonna add a 4th bonus one, but it's an important one. I grew up in Paris, but I never worked in France. I left for Canada for university, and then Ireland, Sweden. But I get asked that question a lot by young aspiring French game developers, and the one thing I tell them is that you gotta speak good English. In general, the answer is communication skills. Communication skills are extremely important. Written communication, oral communication, like, it's very important. And if English is not your native language, you need to learn English. Very important. Because you can be the best programmer or game designer in the world. If you're an asshole, this is not going to work, because game development is a team. It's a team effort constantly. And so, good communication, good team spirit, and human level interactions is probably the most crucial thing, I would say. So communication skills. That's really, I think, if you have good communication skill, and then learning your craft, etc. The second thing I would say is that we are an industry of passionate people, and I've loved games all my life, and I went into games because of my passion for games. But one of the questions I actually asked to anyone when I interview is, what are your hobbies? What are your interests? And if the answer is only playing games, that's a big red flag. So you being open to the world, wanting to do things, doing music, reading books that are not about games, or traveling, learning things, having a craft that does not involve screens is important. Like, I love my safe space is cooking. It's very manual, no screens in like, I never have like a screen with the recipe or anything. I have a friend who works in the games industry. He builds electric guitars, as in, like, he molds the actual wood of the guitar, because it's that thing. I have this other friend who does like woodworking, etc. Like, having something that is not digital and that is a hobby that you're passionate about outside of games is really important. It's going to make you a better game developer, to not be too focused on one thing. And then, I don't know. I mean, the technical skills, definitely. Being open. I think there's a thing on, like, more on the game related thing. Openness to diverse genres. I mean, openness in general. We're talking about communication and diverse interests. Like, that's basically openness. But, like, you have a lot of people, and I've interviewed a lot of people who were very definite on their gaming tastes. Like,
I want to make this kind of game.
Candy Crush is not a game.
Yeah.
Or, like, what do you mean? I think one thing that made my own experience extremely rich is that I worked on MMOs, and I worked on casual games, and I worked on free-to-play and pay-to-play, and all of that, and that opens my horizon, and all these experiences come together.
Yeah. So you kind of believe that you should, start broad as much as you can, learn, and then you head into areas where you go deeper, because there are certain ways, certain games that you might be specializing in, and doing a better job at it.
And also being able to understand why games that you don't necessarily like or are passionate about are still extremely popular. That's really important, because then you understand the player better. It's like, I worked on BGWorld 2 and I worked on Battlefield, and those games are not the same at all, and it's not the same audience at all. but they're both amazing games in their own right, and understanding why players love them and are passionate about them is really important. And even if you're only ever working on real-time strategy games, understanding why a good first-person shooter or a good casual game or a good like cozy simulation is good will make you a better real-time strategy developer, designer, artist, etc. So like having this openness when it comes to the arts and creative industries in general, I think is very, very important. Never be too narrowed on your own personal tastes or passion. Doesn't mean you can't be passionate about it, but like I've talked with way too many people that are so like gatekeeping at like, oh, that's not a real game, or like, well, yes, it is, and you should understand it and understand why players play all of these games that you don't like, that will make you a better developer.
How do you what's your best advice for someone who would like to become lead, or someone who feels that maybe I need to join a bigger studio or whatnot? You know, what how do you feel about how can they prepare for something like that in their career? What's your best advice for that?
One thing that is, I think, something very general is that our industry is very small. It's very small. It's very human, and people help each other all the time, right? I think that's something that's important. This notion of competition between studios and all of that, like it does not exist. Like during my Battlefield promotional days, I spent so much time just hanging out with the Call of Duty people and exchanging like learnings and that kind of stuff. Like, even though in theory, and particularly, there was, from a marketing standpoint, there was the big fight and all of that, right? So one thing that I actually did when we started Rover, I spent the first 3 months just pinging people. Some people that I knew and some people that I did not know, pinging them out of the blue and asking for advice. Asking for genuine advice. As like, hey, we're doing this thing. You've done this thing 2 years before me. Can I buy you lunch, or can I buy you a coffee? And can you tell me? Can you talk to me about your experience? So I would say, like, if anybody's just going on a journey, it's like, we're in Stockholm, we're going to Rome, and we want to be a bit better prepared. Find people who've been to Rome before and ask them. Because I think in the vast majority of cases, people will gladly share their experience. And then it's also possibly through the same mean of like talking to people, it's also understanding why you want to go to a certain job or go to a certain size of company, etc., and figuring out one way or another whether you're actually gonna whether that's actually what you're gonna find, right? Because there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of preconceptions around what does it mean to work at EA or at Paradox or at Ubisoft or at a startup, which might not necessarily be true. And so if you're doing like a career step for a very specific reason, make sure that you don't end up being very disappointed because it's not at all how you envisioned it, right? And again, I think the best way is to talk to people. There's also an important thing because our industry is very globalized. A lot of the things that we are reading, myself included, particularly if it's in English, is actually very US or UK focused. There's not necessarily a lot of kind of local content. What you're doing with this podcast is, I think, extremely valuable, as in to give English-speaking content for the Swedish games industry, even though I think that's what we're talking about is applicable everywhere. So also not assuming, particularly when it comes to the US, which is, very similar in a way, but also a very different country with different rules, with different working culture, etc. Not assuming that what you're reading or watching or listening to in podcast format, etc., that is happening in the US is actually valid to you if you're developer in Sweden or in France or in Italy or in Bulgaria or anything like that, right? Because work cultures are very different, and I love consuming information. I feel like I need to feed my body. I love food, and I need to feed my brain all the time because I love it. And on any topic. And I've read a lot of kind of, books around the games industry and kind of business books and process books, etc. And now I have enough experience to notice when some of these books are absolutely not applicable to a Swedish company because, Swedish welfare state and social security and healthcare and all that kind of stuff means that people don't have the same relationship with a company than they might have in the US, right? So it's important that people who have a bit less experience don't take what they read and what they hear for granted. Like first-hand experience and talking to people is quite important.
When we've talked about live service subscriptions, AI tools is in there as well somewhere. What do you think will define the future for us in terms of making games? And how does Rover play a part in that?
I mean, I know where the part we want to play in there. I think this industry is evolving incredibly fast. I remember talking with some of our interns who are younger, explaining that, I worked on some mobile games before smartphone existed, and it was a different world. Or, we come from a world where mobile phones were not a thing, and people were, playing games and very different things. So I think there's this constant evolution. I think it's important to understand that the only constant is change. Actually, that's wrong. There's two constants. One is change, and the other one is that players will always be attracted by a good game experience. I think there's I don't believe and I don't follow the doomsayers. Like for the past 20 years, people have been saying, maybe not the past, for 25 years, but not the past 5, people have been saying PC gaming is so dead. And now PC gaming is, the second biggest force in the games industry after mobile. So I don't think, if people make grand predictions of like, this is completely dead, this will never work or anything, or this is the past, I disagree. It's going to change consistently, but players will always go to great game experiences. One, and I think the second one, which I think will always be a constant, is that players will always use games as a social place, as a way to interact with each other, including single player games. Recently I've been playing this cozy bookshop management game called Tiny Bookshop, and it's a single player game, and it's really, it's a single player, a great, very cozy, very nice game. And for me, it is a social experience because I love reading and books, and I am talking about this game a lot with my friends who are avid readers and avid gamers. And so that shows how single player experiences are also social places, and games, no matter the genre, no matter whether the single player or multiplayer or anything, are social places, and I don't think that's going to change. So those two things: great creative vision, great gameplay experience. Focus on gameplay over technology, because technology is going to evolve, it's going to change, it's going to bring amazing things, it's going to bring terrible things, and that's going to be a constant. But a great game experience, and knowing that players want to share and want to talk and want to use games as a way to interact with their friends and with new people they've never met. I think those two things will always be there. And I think that is tied to, why we are very focused on the gameplay experience at Rover rather than technology or any buzzwords or anything like that. And we are very focused on creating great, in this case, cooperative experience, because we believe that games are social, are social media. Not in the social media side, but they are social, and they are a social creative experience, and we want players to enjoy the worlds and the experiences and the stories we build together with the people they love.
If you could go back to your younger self, like the start of your career, what one piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
You mean advice that I did not have? I think there my expectation on the industry was, I had no expectation. I was just like, I'm just gonna make games. Whatever. This has been the constant when I was young. I was just like, I'm gonna make games, or I'm gonna work in games somehow. Whatever it is, I'm gonna do that. So my career has been very fluid in that level. I think the one thing where I've had the hardest learnings has been um, understanding how companies work, and in the world of kind of like office politics, and how hard that world can be. I'm not a This is not my forte. I've never been like an office politician or anything, like not, having career goals or anything. It just, whatever happened to me just ended up happening. But particularly in my first few experiences, I've had some hard, punches, philosophical punches in the face from not understanding that some things are just not said, or the company goes in this direction, and yes, you're raising a good point, but you're stepping on so many toes. Because I was kind of happy-go-lucky. It's like, well, this is what we should do to please our players. It's like, yes, but this is what we should do to please our shareholders, and this is what we're gonna do. So please do not raise that other point anymore, and things like that, right? And so my younger self did not have the maturity to actually navigate those things, and that led to very painful experiences. And so I think, particularly for younger people who are looking to get into larger companies, understanding that there's other forces at play than just making a great game for players. Whether it be, career progression or company direction or things like that, is necessary, because, big companies or mid-sized companies, that's just how it works. Like, that's just normal. That's just, normal human behavior, and not blaming anyone for, I was just, when I was at EA, looking from afar at the Game of Thrones of the leadership of EA, was like, well, I mean, obviously they're senior level executives, and that's the game they play. But, when I joined the EA, I had been in the industry for something like 14 years already. So I had learned those lessons. And I have seen so many frustrated people in, particularly in the big companies, being like, I don't understand why we're not doing this, whereas it would make for a better product or anything. It's like, well, because that decision was taken with another goal in mind than making a better game. So I think, looking back at my younger self, understanding how to navigate bigger companies and their incentives and all that kind of stuff, like, that part of the corporate life, was what actually brought me the most pain. You feel it less in smaller companies. It's probably why I just ended up back in a smaller company with a smaller team, where we can just talk about everything transparently and not having to worry about this. But the journey leads you to, different kind of corporations, and that's an important part of just any work life, whether in the industry or not. So that's good to know for young people out there who dream of working for like their favoritist AAA studio. Is like, it's not all fun and games, but it's amazing. Do it.
Just try and stay the course.
Yeah, exactly. I understand. It's about it's navigating this, right? It's a job. That's actually an important thing to tell for a lot of people. It's a passion. You can be passionate about games and not work in games. Once you work in games, you can stay passionate about games. Most people who work in games are still passionate. I know I am, but it's also a job. It's not, you're not here to, it's great if you have fun, but like, it's a job. You come in, you have a role, people pay you, and
You
you
still
make
need to
amazing
perform.
things, and it's magic. But it's still working in a company, and you have obligations, etc. And it's important to understand that it's not the same as making games as a hobby. When you're in a company, like, I think if you're two people making an indie game, that's completely different, right? But that's also a different kind of culture and a different kind of thing to navigate, to make sure that you don't actually get into a fight with your one co-founder or something like that, right? But it's making games is a big industry. It's a lot of money. It's a job, and sometimes you have to understand that it's important to understand how to navigate the corporatism of game studios, or game publishers, or any company tied to the games industry.
At this point, we wrapped up the interview and prepare to publish it shortly after. But sometimes things don't go as planned. And as the interview was going to air end of 2025, news broke that Rover was halting operations and later filed for bankruptcy. It's rare to be able to talk about a before and after scenario of this kind, and considering the state of the industry at the moment, we agreed while things were still fresh to do a follow-up interview on what happened and why things didn't work out. That will be available in the next episode. See you soon.